Welcome to this week's episode of Accredited Investor Markets Radio. Each week, we speak with you about investing in alternative assets. Unbiased and beholden to no one, Accredited Investor Markets Radio does not accept advertising from any investment firm or financial advisor. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is the spoken word sister of AccreditedInvestorMarkets.com, the internet's most comprehensive and unbiased educational resource about crowdfunding, angel investing, venture capital, private equity, private shares, and other investment classes beyond publicly traded stocks and bonds.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Accredited Investor Markets Radio. I am Christopher Cahill, your host. Later on, I will have the privilege of speaking with Vincent Zurzolo of Metropolis Collectibles. As the title suggests, we'll be talking specifically about comic books. And yes, there are some valued in the millions. First, let's talk about another kind of book. The 300,000 books that are published in the United States every year and the blurbs that are on them and the marketing effect of blurbs. Blurbs, of course, being the non-pithy or pithy things said about a book by some luminary to help market the book that are written on the book or in the flap or whatever of the book. Anyway, we have big data. We have algorithms. Everything is tracked. Everything is chipped, quantified, and therefore understood, at least quantitatively, as a factor in large-scale marketing, but not blurbs. Evidently, nobody knows what blurbs do or don't do for books. And I'm relying here on a very engaging and witty article in NPR dated September 27, 2015 by Colin Dwyer. The name of the article is "Forget the Book, Have You Read This Irresistible Story on Blurbs?" Mr. Dwyer correctly points out to something that's really bothered me in reading many blurbs over the years, and that is the common presence of the words compelling and luminous and other empty adjectives in blurbs. I don't know what causes people when they're writing a blurb or otherwise very fine authors to have recourse to compelling and luminous as though there were no other words available. These words are often, by the way, also found in seemingly highbrow movie reviews, film reviews written as reviews of filmic things. I digress. Some of the blurbers are in on the racket. Best-selling novelist Gary Steingart, I call him a comic novelist. I've read some of his books. They're very, very funny, but about 1 micron deep, in my opinion. You're listening to firecrackers all the time, and even the big ones start to sound puny after a while. Well, he says, I can figure out things pretty quickly, meaning that he just reads a few lines from the book at the beginning or in the middle, and then he writes his blurb. He's written more than 150 at this point. As Steingart says, and Dwyer is quoting him, I've compared people to Shakespeare, Tolstoy, or whatever. I'll do anything. Well, that's good to know if you're reading a blurb by Gary Steingart. But as I said, I personally don't take him all that seriously to begin with. Now, Frank McCourt's another matter. The late memoirist, Frank McCourt, very charming, and he wrote a brilliantly funny and evocative, luminous, and compelling book on his teaching in public schools in New York. Well, Dwyer points out that Frank McCourt has said that of a book as a blurber, Frank McCourt has said, quote, "You'll claw yourself with pleasure," end quote. And I resisted the temptation to use an Irish brogue when I said that. They said, you'll claw yourself with pleasure, not once, not twice, but 3 different times on 3 different books. So Mr. McCourt was not taking his job as a blurber, anyway, particularly seriously. But then maybe blurbing was never very serious. The word itself was coined in 1907 by a humorist named Gillette Burgess, who wrote a book with the great title, Are You a Bromide? Well, the book featured a woman he called Miss Belinda Blurb. And Miss Belinda Blurb extolled the book's manifold virtues from its cover. I'm quoting from this article. Well, that's very fitting. I like the word bromide. I'm very happy that Gillette Burgess used that as part of the setup for the blurb. Now, I like the word bromide very much because it sounds like something chemical, and indeed it is something chemical. A bromide is defined strictly as a binary compound of bromine with another element or a radical, including some used as sedatives, including potassium bromide, or generally a drug that makes a person calm. In the case of literature or ordinary speech, a bromide is a commonplace hackneyed statement or notion, and I suggest that it sedates the critical faculty. Now, whether that sells books, again, nothing in this article says yes or no because it's not known. A final note. The word bro has a contemporary ring that's somewhat specific anyway. We all know what is meant when somebody says, yeah, some bros came in here after the Cubs game and bought a whole lot of beer and some wine, which didn't seem very bro-ish. I actually heard somebody say that the other day. Well, and if you want to learn more about that, go see the indispensable Urban Dictionary online. I'd like to suggest a bromide may be the sorts of things said by a bro as he's holding a red plastic cup at a kegger. Moving on, this is an investment program after all. So let's talk about accredited investor markets, the nesting place for this podcast. And there's an article on accreditedinvestormarkets.com of some importance to accredited investors out there. It's entitled A Little Known Option for Investing in Private Equity. It's by Christopher Orr. Christopher Orr is Director of Institutional Products at Pensco, P-E-N-S-C-O, which helps people understand options in private equity, among other things. But he points out a few things that are worth considering. It's a low-yield environment, and private equity has defeated the S&P 500, even including dividends, and even taking into account private equity fees. Private equity has defeated the S&P 500 over the last 10 years by 5.9%. And as for this being a low-yield environment, I refer you to the interview we will have with Vitaly Katznelson in a few weeks. He will describe the low-yield environment starting in the year 2000 to the present and beyond. But anyway, another suggestion that Mr. Orr makes, or a suggestion Mr. Orr makes, is that people can not only get access to private equity without being giants. This, by the way, is something discussed by Sang Lee of Dark Matter on a podcast of a few months ago, right here on this program. So you can do it, and it might be intelligent to use your IRA to do it. After all, IRAs are tax advantaged. And if you can shift the money, a sensible amount, of course, in the context of other planning with regard to your IRA, if you shift an amount into private equity and maintain the tax advantage of the IRA, well, you're offsetting one of the disadvantages of investing in private equity. Invest in private equity, you must have a long time horizon because you put the money in, but you don't get anything until there's a buyout or some similar event. But the time horizons of private equity match those of a retirement account. Interesting stuff. Interesting to me, certainly. Finally, Life Hacks is a feature of Financial Poise, short articles intended to orient ourselves toward health, wealth, and wisdom. And there's a life hack up on Financial Poise right now concerning a book. The book is titled Rich Habits, Wealth Gap, or Parent Gap. I have no idea, by the way, who the blurbers are on this book. However, I do know something about the author because he's going to be on Accredited Investor Markets Radio in about a month. His name is Thomas Corley. Very interesting man. Interesting that he's telling us stuff we ought to already know. He did his own empirical study of a few hundred wealthy people and a few hundred unwealthy people, and concluded that wealthy people, quote, do certain things every single day that set them apart from everyone else in life. Wealthy people have good daily success habits that they learned from their parents. These daily habits are the real reason for the wealth gap in our country and the real reason why the rich get richer. And the life hack presents 16 specific different things that Thomas Corley advocates with regard to your children. Yes, he wants to tell you how to raise your children. Here are 2. Reassure children that mistakes are good, not bad. Children need to understand that the very foundation of success in life is built on learning from our mistakes. I assume he's talking not about non-judgmentalism per se, morally, for example, but rather that it's by failing to get something done that you learn how to do something right. So it's a good thing. You learn that way. Secondly, Corley says, teach children that seeking financial success in life is good and is a worthwhile goal. Children need to learn what the American dream is and that it is something to be pursued in life. Well, here. I'm glad somebody said it out loud. It didn't need to be said a few generations ago, but it needs to be rung from the highest hilltops these days. Anyway, let's get to the interview. Well, I have with me today Vincent Zurzolo. Vincent, one of the nation's leading comic book aficionados. He and Stephen Fischler combined companies in 1999. Fischler had been running Metropolis Collectibles since 1985, and they are Metropolis Collectibles today, having joined forces. Metropolis Collectibles has maintained the status of the world's largest dealership for vintage comics. Metropolis holds several records recognized by Guinness, including having sold the first comic book for $1 million, a record which Metropolis has since surpassed. Metropolis also sold the world's most valuable check, and that is the famous check written from DC Comics to the creators of Superman. That's why DC Comics has had Superman, for all of $160. In 2007, Metropolis started ComicConnect.com, an auction and consignment arm. Vincent, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Well, of course, we're going to talk about The Simpsons first. Why? Because they had an early Season 2, Episode 21, episode called 3 Men and a Comic Book. In that episode, Bart and his 2 friends decide to invest in Radioactive Man. Wait, it was 3 friends. So it was 4 guys together decided to invest in the first edition of Radioactive Man for $100. Now, really, the show was about exposing the character of the 4 boys involved under stress, but it got me thinking about an article that appears in AccreditedInvestorMarkets.com. There are several articles on comic books in AccreditedInvestorMarkets.com, including one by yourself, Vince. But this one's called Investing in Comics by David Moses, and it has some charts. Now, I was a boy about Bart's age in 1970. One of these charts compares the value of specific comics in 1970, 2010, and 2013. And in 1970, Captain America #1, sort of like Radioactive Man #1, was worth $150. And now, according to the Blue Book of comics, which is called Overstreet, it's worth $300,000. If only I had been as intelligent as those boys on that comic, I'd be sitting pretty.
Right. So let me tell you that comic books have been a great investment tool for me and for many of my clients over the last 30 years that I've been involved in comic books. I started off when I was about 15 years old, and I've been buying and selling comic books since then. I started off working out of my parents' basement, and I'm now co-owner of the largest dealership for vintage comic books in the world. I sold comic books on the streets of Manhattan to finance guys back in the early 90s when I got out of college. And I wasn't even born in 1970 where this chart starts off with, where it shows Captain America #1 at $150 in 1970, then $215,000 in 2010, and $300,000 in 2013. Now, what's really interesting about the Overstreet Price Guide, it's a very, very valuable tool, but it is what it says it is. It's a guide. And just to give you an idea, my company in 2011 sold a Captain America #1 CGC graded 9.2 for $303,000. We sold another one in 2012 for $306,000. So that's back in 2012, before a year before this price guide says it was worth $300,000. So the market on Captain America has really, really heated up. And what's amazing about Captain America is there was a period in time where I had about 10 copies of #1 in my inventory, and it were very difficult to sell. What happened though was they greenlit the movie for Captain America and the Avengers and things like that. And when that happened, and when they were major successes, I think it brought people's eyes back to Captain America as not only a great comic book and an interesting comic book and a great concept and a very patriotic character, but also as an incredibly undervalued golden age comic book commodity. And that is why I believe the price of this book has jumped up so much in the last 5-6 years. And what we've seen time and again is when there's an interesting property that's turned into a movie or a television show, you see an incredible increase in value. Now, that's not the only reason comic books do increase in value. There are many different facets to the reason for appreciation in vintage comic books. However, that has been something that's been kind of a catalyst and easy for people to see and spot. I'll give you, for instance, Daredevil #1 was a mediocre character, mediocre selling comic book, but as soon as the Daredevil Netflix series came out, and it was such a big hit, the first appearance of Daredevil went through the roof. To give you just an idea, in the last 3-4 months, a copy in 9.6 condition you probably could have gotten last year, let's say, for $25,000 to $35,000. I sold a copy last week for $47,000.
Well, Vincent, I must stop you because you referred to the 9-point condition. That's on a 10-point scale, right? So that's very, very good.
It is on a 10-point scale, and this is the scale that my partner Stephen Fischler created, and that's used throughout the entire world of vintage comic book collecting and even modern comic collecting. So we created that grading scale. It's used around the world, and it is a scale based on 1 to 10, 10 being the ultimate high-grade mint comic book, but 9.4 is considered near mint, 9.6 near mint plus, and 9.8 near mint. There are many comic books you can buy in very low grades that will sell for great money, rare comic books, and even not so rare comic books, but very high-demand comic books. I'll give you another, for instance, the first appearance of Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy 15. Now, this is my personal favorite comic book and character. I love Spider-Man. I think Spider-Man is just such a great character for so many different reasons. I think he's very relatable. I think people really enjoy the struggles that this person goes through on a daily basis, and not just this all-powerful superhero who has everything going for him. Exactly. Kind of like Superman usually has no problems. But what you have with Amazing Fantasy 15 is, in my opinion, the blue chip of blue chip comic books. This is a comic book that people always want. And to give you an idea, to give you a base point to understand it, you'll see from the chart, the Amazing Fantasy 15 in 1970 was $16. In 2010, it was $100,000. In 2013, it was $175,000. And those prices, by the way, are for a 9.2 copy or 9.4, 9.2 copy. So the concept here is, wow, it's appreciated. Now, let's talk about the low-grade aspects of an Amazing Fantasy 15. Now, 5 years ago, you could buy a copy in good condition, which is a low-grade copy. Good is the nomenclature grade. 2.0 is the number grade, the numeric grade. Okay, 2.0 copy for probably 5 years ago, I'd say $5,000. That copy, maybe a little less. Nowadays, you couldn't touch a copy 2.0 for less than probably $9,500, and that's only in a few years. I was at a convention last week in Chicago, and I was buying up a storm. I bought every copy I could get my hands on, and I was paying retail prices for Amazing Fantasy 15, and the reason, I can't get them otherwise. So I bought them at retail prices, and my concept is I'm going to just tack on 10, 15%, and I'll sell them. And they'll sell probably in the next 1 to 6 months. And the reason I would do that is, first of all, is show me another place where I can make 10% in 3 months, so a day to 6 months. And when I say day to 6 months, the only reason I'm so confident in saying things like this is because I've done it over and over again. I've been doing this for 30 years. I know the market inside and out, backwards and forwards.
Well,
There's nobody in the marketplace that's more well-versed in comic books and investing in comic books than me and my team here.
Well, let me ask you this then. It sounds like, I'm going to ask you two questions in one. It sounds like the market may be divided between perennials like Spider-Man, which even without the movies, I'm sure would still be very, very popular.
True.
And then others that are you never hear about unless they're turned into a movie. With regard to that second category, do you, as a market participant, pay attention to movie deal making in Hollywood so you might get a leg up on this sort of thing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We keep our eyes and ears open and to see what's going on. I'll give you, for instance, when they announced that character Harley Quinn was going to be in the Suicide Squad movie for DC Comics, that her first appearance in Batman Adventures number 12 from 1990, I want to say 4, went through the roof. And these are comic books that are not even, around 20 years old and selling for $1,000 easy. And so it's very interesting, very exciting to see all the different characters that are becoming popular and the demand for those characters going up. Now, I'll give you another, for instance. Here's a character, Deadpool, who I'm not I don't really follow Deadpool that very much, but if you go to any comic book convention around the world, not just in the United States, you will see countless number of people, men and women, boys and girls, dressed up as Deadpool. He's a weird kind of mutant assassin his face is completely scarred up and burned, and he's got a healing factor, but he doesn't heal his face. I don't get that, but he is basically kind of like an R-rated Bugs Bunny assassin. Like he wisecracks and things like that. Yeah. It's a really weird character. It's very funny, but the comic book, his first appearance was in New Mutants '98. That's from I think early '90s, and it's going up in value every year. It's just going up and up and up, and to the point now that they just in this past summer announced that the Deadpool movie is in production with Ryan Reynolds as the star, and I watched the trailer the other day, and it was hysterical, and I guarantee that movie is going to be huge. It'll be huge, and that comic book will continue to grow and grow. There are certain types of blue-chip characters that come around. I usually call like the iconic character of that decade. For the 1930s and 40s, it was Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Captain America. Then in the 60s, it's Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and X-Men, and the 1950s, I would say, it was the Flash and Green Lantern. And what you see now is there's these characters from the 70s, like Wolverine, Swamp Thing, the new X-Men. You see characters from the 80s, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Crow. You see characters from the 90s, Deadpool and Harley Quinn. And you're just blown away by seeing how these characters become entrenched in the psyche of pop culture enthusiasts. And it's not just comic books, it's everywhere. You look around, you walk on any major city street, you're going to see people wearing superhero t-shirts, superhero tattoos, superhero backpacks, superhero this, superhero that. It's everywhere. Everybody loves this stuff. It's part of the pop culture lexicon of the world.
Well, Vincent, I'd like to return to that theme, but I don't want to leave the dollars and cents theme quite yet. Sure. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Maybe this is an artifact of my own kids growing up that I don't see it much anymore. Is the vector for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, flat nowadays? Is it lowering? And the second part of this compound question is, are there some comics that were hot that aren't so hot anymore?
Sure. Okay, I can give you some examples of both. First of all, the Turtles are very hot, and they will continue to be hot because I think anybody who grew up reading the Turtles has a good job, making some money, and they're reflecting back on their lives, and they're getting nostalgic. And what do? When you're nostalgic about something, you want to recapture your youth, you go out and buy Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1. There was a time you could not sell Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1. It was soft as all get out. But in the last 10 years, it's just gone up and up and up to the point I sold a 9/8 copy, I think, for $15,000 a few years ago. I probably couldn't buy that copy back for $20,000 if I tried. But there are titles that don't sell so well over time. So, for instance, back 20, 30 years ago, Westerns and Tarzan comic books and jungle comic books were much more popular than they are today. Something a little bit more contemporary to compare to would be a character like Green Lantern. So when they made the movie Green Lantern, it was a bomb, and the values of the comic books had been escalating probably a year to 6 months beforehand, and then when the movie hit and it was a bomb, people lost interest, and the values dropped probably about 25%. But I will say this, Green Lantern himself, first appearance in Showcase 22, Green Lantern #1, those are comic books that are still have come back and are still in high demand because people realize how rare they are. And they're also realizing that DC Comics has a big plan, just like Marvel, and they're doing a Justice League movie, and most likely there will be a Green Lantern in the Justice League movies. So far right now they've greenlit a Wonder Woman movie, and Wonder Woman has been on fire for about 2 years now. And I will tell you this, I've been touting Wonder Woman as an extremely undervalued comic book. Wonder Woman #1, Sensation #1, and All-Star 8, which is the first comic book featuring Wonder Woman. These are all three of the major comic books that Wonder Woman appeared in early on, and they've gone up so much over the last few years. It's insane. I think there's a lot of potential here. I think that Wonder Woman is a very undervalued character still, and there are so many others. Marvel Comics #1, the first published Marvel comic book, for a long time was the #1 comic book. You know, that was the comic book to get. Action #1, thanks to my company, has surpassed it. We've sold over 26 copies over the last 7 years, and ranging in 2008 from a record sale of a 6.0 for $317,200 to last year our purchase of the world's most valuable and expensive comic book, Action Comics #1, in 9.0 condition for $3.2 million, which we bought last year, about 2 days ago last year. Yeah, and we've sold an Action 1 for $1 million, for $1.5, for $2.2, and a whole bunch of other ones in between and below. And it's an exciting time. When you look at other types of collectibles, other type of investment collectibles, you look at pop art, you look at quote-unquote fine art, you look at stamps, coins, baseball cards. Comic books are still behind on compared to those, and they're still catching up. So I think comic books, when we hit the $1 million mark, before that, comic books were in their infancy. When we hit that mark, they kind of hit their adolescence. Now I think they're in their adolescence, and we still have a lot of room to go. I believe within the next 10 to 15 years, you will see major museums buying comic books for their exhibits, for permanent exhibits. I see these things happening.
They will get people walking through the door when they do that.
Right. And
let me ask you about popular culture again, but through your own experience, because I was reading an interview of you by Scoop. This is a childhood scene from your childhood, from, I can call it no other thing than Rockaway Beach, because of
right on.
phones. But you were asked if you remember when you became aware of comics under the circumstances, and I'm just going to read. You said, I think it would have to be Ghost Rider #19. I remember lying on my bedroom floor, which was carpeted in a classic 1970s powder blue carpet. It was midday. The sunlight was streaming into the room, and I had my little fishbowl nearby with my pet crayfish. I don't think I could really read very well at the time, and I was very confused by the cover. I didn't understand that Ghost Rider was a good guy because he looked like a bad guy. I also didn't get why the devil was angry at him and what the devil was shooting out of his hands, fire blasts of some sort. It's funny remembering that moment. I notice with many of my early comic experiences, when I recall them, I can see the room, smell the air, remember how the sun came in through the windows, and that's pretty amazing to me. So yes, this is an experience you think others might have and which may power some of this sustained interest in comic books?
Well, here's what I think. First of all, I think that I'm definitely not alone in those types of recollections. Comic books, one of the most important things I teach all of my salespeople is you're not just selling the comic book. You're selling the story behind the comic book, how the person who collected this comic book put his collection together, and how we can convey that story to the public, as well as finding out what the connection is for the buyer. Now, everybody has read it. I hope everybody's read a comic book in their life. And for some people it was not the most meaningful event, and for other people it was the most meaningful event. But many of the people who have that nostalgic feeling for comic books will very quickly remember their first comic book, or very quickly remember their first. My dad took me to the local candy store. My uncle took me to a comic book show. Whatever it was, my grandfather had a collection, a box in the attic, and he let me read one. I couldn't believe the art. All these types of things, and they're beautiful parts of people's lives. They're things that mean a lot to people. They're nostalgic. They're memories. They're the fabric of what makes you who you are. And it's not just, obviously comic books. For everybody has something like this for some part of their life. Sometimes for people it's sports. Sometimes it's I became a lawyer because my father. I watched 12 Angry Men. It could be anything. So you have all these different things that help to make us who we are. And for me, and for a lot of people I know, a big part of their childhood was vintage comic books. And what I've also come to experience is that it wasn't just an investment aspect. It hardly ever was when we were kids. It was the excitement, the escapism, the fun, the entertainment value of comic books. But beyond that also, there were also educational aspects to comics. My brother helped teach our next door neighbor how to read using comic books. And these are things that you go, wow, that's pretty cool. There's so many. We used to trade them in elementary school. My friends and I, we didn't flip baseball cards. We traded comic books. We used to write and draw and make our own comic books. I ran into a friend of mine that I hadn't seen since high school. He was the first guy I ever bought a comic book collection from. And I hadn't seen him in 10 years. I was at a comic book convention, and I'm walking down the hall, and I hear a guy say, "Hey, V, what are you doing here?" And I turn around. I'm like, I see my friend. He's got green hair. I haven't seen him in 10 years since we were kids. And I go, "Oh, I sell comic books. What are you doing here?" He's like, "Well, I draw comic books." So we were both pulled into the world of comic books, but in very different ways. Still draws them, and I still sell them, and it's just a really cool thing. And so, these are different parts of the business and the hobby that really affect people in a lot of different ways. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me ask maybe more of a compound, complex question. It will be impossible to follow. But anyway.
Okay, I'll give it my best.
Email has replaced letter writing and sending, and this has affected the market in stamps. This is something we discussed at Accredited Investor Markets Radio with Chad Snee of Lynn's Stamp some time ago. So that stamps are now antiquarian. The only stamps that matter are ones that were printed a long time ago. Well, okay, the analogy is certainly not perfect with comic books, however. We do have video on demand. We do have personal electronic devices, and they're very sophisticated. The images are really good. May they displace comic books? Have they already to some degree? What are your thoughts about it?
I'm going to say, I can't say it better than Stan the Man Lee said it. And when he was asked if digital comic books would replace comic books, he said, "Comics are like boobs. They look great on a computer, but I'd rather hold one in my hand." That's not me. That's Stan Lee.
That can hardly be improved upon, I'm sure. Let me ask you.
Seriously speaking, digital comic books are great. I'm all for them. Anything that gets people reading more comic books will eventually lead people to buy and collect and invest in paper comic books. What I'm not concerned at all that it would replace it. If you went to half the conventions I went to and see all the people running around the rooms buying comic books, there's no way these things are disappearing in our lifetime. But here's the other thing. You cannot make a digital comic book a collectible.
Right.
And until somebody can figure that out, paper comic books are always going to be around. That's my theory.
Okay, let me just ask you a very low voltage question. In 3 Men and a Comic Book, the show that I talked about earlier by The Simpsons, you had a syndicate of boys investing in a book. Are there syndicates of investors buying these $1 million comic books? Has it gotten?
Well, most of my buyers for the 7-figure books have been individuals. Actually, I'd say all of them. But I can tell you, that there are times where collectors will band together and, hey, I can't afford this alone. Would you like to go in on it with me? And they do. And again, it's in a certain way. My partner and I are 2 men in a comic book. We merged companies in 1999, in July of 99, and we had the world's largest company in vintage comic books, and we actually grew the business substantially. And in 2007, when we started Comic Connect, we grew it again. And we invest all the time in comic books. We don't always buy things and just flip them. There are many times we'll buy and hold. We have an inventory of over $150,000 comics in our Manhattan showroom. We also started an original art gallery. We just held our first art show opening in April for a Frank Frazetta show, and we had over 500 people through the door on the opening weekend with an exhibit with over $5 million worth of art. We'll be set up at the New York Comic Con. We have people coming in from all over the world making appointments with us. Then they travel to New York City and coming into our Midtown showroom. We have a gorgeous 5,000 square foot showroom. It's a dream come true for me, coming from a guy who was selling comics on the streets of Manhattan and started the business out of my parents' basement, basically. So I believe in this stuff. I love investing in it. My partner and I are those two men in a comic book. Yeah, that's definitely the situation. If you saw my office right now, the walls are adorned with comic art. There are stacks of comic books everywhere. There's so many cool things, and I wanted to make it a place where it would be really fun to work in, and I think I've achieved that. And, they say if you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. I definitely work every day of my life, and I definitely do love what I do. And I feel very blessed and fortunate to be able to do this. And I love the idea and concept of sharing my passion with people and helping them to turn their love of it into either a great collection or something to invest in, or a combination. It's a joy every day. And one other thing I always tell people, and when people say, oh, you should invest in stocks, you shouldn't invest in collectibles, I say, well, look, you have a Fortune 500 company, and one guy makes a mistake, and the next day the stock plummets. Or you have something like what's going on right now with China. Their fake economy is coming back to bite them on the butt, and their stock market's plunging, and they're trying to pour tons more money into the marketplace, and it's caused the devaluation of the Chinese currency, the yuan. And what's now doing it? It's causing problems in the U.S. and it's going to cause problems all around the world. There's nothing that's going to happen that's going to make people hate or not believe in Spider-Man or Superman or Batman. Ain't going to happen.
On that note, and in great admiration of your enthusiasm and the way you lived your life, Vincent, I got to say it's been great talking with you.
Well, thanks so much for making time for me. I do appreciate it, and I hope I was able to answer your questions in a fun and informative way.
Oh yeah. Well, this has been another edition of Accredited Investor Markets Radio. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is produced by Stephanie Strait. For further information about comics and investing in comics, please go to accreditedinvestormarkets.com. There are multiple articles, including by Mr. Zurzolo and Mr. Moses and others, that will help guide you along. Thank you for listening. Let's do this again sometime.
Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe through iTunes or Stitcher, or you can download our app from Libsyn. You can also listen right on our website, www.AIMkts.com. Each week, Accredited Investor Markets Radio brings you news and education about investing with a focus on alternative assets. To see a short written summary of this episode, go to www.AIMkts.com. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is a production of Financial Poise Radio Productions, LLC.